panel and the panelists because they have been working and researching on the ground, working with survivors, working with victims, doing the research, trying to figure out what's going on. So we're really excited to have them all here. So for this panel, the objective is to unpack the rise of scamming compounds across Asia as a modern site of trafficking and forced criminality, exposing transnational criminal networks that demands urgent collective action. So we're going to kind of do three parts to this. The first, we're going to set the scene, talking about the global landscape and political criminal nexus. Then we're going to go into structural enablers and the victim-perpetrator spectrum. And finally, talking about on the ground, what's going on with survivors and their realities and the responses and response gaps. So to get started, we're actually just going to let everybody introduce themselves. BC, would you like to start?
Testing. There we go. Good morning, everyone. So hi, I'm BC. I'm based in Singapore. I'm from Singapore. I work for a company called Kroll, and we're essentially investigators working on a broad range of issues. But I've been an investigator for about 20 years. I have a very unhealthy fascination with organized crime, so I've been tracking that for many years. And then obviously, as it evolved, then I found myself doing investigations on the same people that are involved with the scamming operations and the scamming compounds. And that's how I found myself sitting on this panel. So great to meet everyone. I'm happy to share what we've collected over the last 15 years, honestly, on this topic.
Sharlene?
Hi, good morning, everyone. My name is Sharlene Chen from Humanity Research Consultancy, HRC. So I've been with HRC for about 5 years. We are a social enterprise and also an international development consultancy based in the UK. So we specialize in anti-human trafficking and modern slavery research. And in the past few years, we've been particularly focusing on the vulnerable people being exploited by the criminals, and also the trafficking in person that are related to the scam industry. And we also highlight the survivor engagement and also engagement of the experts with lived experience and all of our research. So I just want to share through our work, we realized that apart from survivor engagement in policy development, policy change, and also all kinds of research, we also found out that survivors really have the power and potential to directly change people's life. This could include, for example, a survivor could be, well, since they have the experience of being exploited and trafficked, they could be sharing locations, information about the criminals, the compounds with the law enforcement, and ensure that all of the rescue efforts could be operated more smoothly. And also they could be supporting all of their fellow survivors in their home countries and prevent them from being re-trafficked and support all of the reintegration efforts. So I also want to take this chance to thank all of the speakers, researchers, or survivor leaders who have shared their experience, your stories with us yesterday and also today and tomorrow. You guys are amazing. Thank you.
Thank you. So, BC, you've been tracking the rise of scamming compounds across borders for years. Can you give us kind of the big picture, the global overview of how these operations have evolved from isolated fraud schemes to these large-scale, politically protected trafficking hubs that we're seeing today? And also, what are the key countries involved in this trafficking triangle, source, transit, and destination?
Sure. So, well, first of all, we're starting a little bit early. I've found Mechelle. She's running across now.
Yay!
So we're starting a bit early. So I guess I have 5 more minutes than I initially intended to. So I'll take my time, drag this as long as I can. No. Yeah. So obviously, I think we're gonna share a lot more today, and then the discourse and the discussions that we're gonna have throughout the day is gonna enrich everyone's knowledge of the situation. But I think, except people living under the rock, in the last 1 year, you've seen so many front page news around these scamming compounds, around the exponentially increasing. There she is.
Yay, come on up.
Mechelle. We were, then we decided not to. Welcome. Okay, maybe we'll let Mechelle introduce herself.
Sure.
Give context.
We were doing intros.
Oh, okay. Hi, I'm the very late Mechelle Moore from Global Alms. Apologize, I was just talking to Helen before she left. We've got a couple of minutes? Yeah. Okay. So my NGO is... Whew, I just ran up the stairs. My NGO is a grassroots organisation based out of Mesot in Tak province in Thailand. And we have been working in training and prevention for, I think, almost 12 years now. We moved into protection very quickly after moving to Mesot. We set up an emergency response team. I founded a program called Yes She Matters, which is supporting clients of gender-based violence and child trafficking. And then when the scamming compounds kicked off in Myanmar, we added that crime typology onto what we're doing. So we have a hotline, an emergency response team, all very trained, very well qualified. We have an emergency shelter where we assist victims of trafficking and gender-based violence. And then we work very closely in with government services and Royal Thai Police, Ministry of Justice, DSI, to not only help potential victims of trafficking report, but then support them through that reporting process and the judicial system. And then once they repatriate back to their home country, we are now starting to assist different countries through their embassies and different CSOs in reintegration processes.
Awesome. I'll read the question again just to reorient us. This one was for BC about the fact that you've been tracking this for a long time. So the questions were, can you give us a global overview, and how have these operations evolved from isolated fraud schemes into the large-scale, politically protected trafficking hubs that we're seeing today? And what are the key countries involved in the trafficking triangle: source, transit, and destination?
Sure. So I was saying, everyone's seen the news articles and everything, right? So the key countries that I think will come to our top of our mind, and that have been getting a really bad reputation in terms of forced criminality and forced trafficking vis-a-vis the scamming compounds: Myanmar, for sure, north of Myanmar, and the borders of Myanmar to Thailand in Mewadi, which Mechelle will share a lot. And that's where I've learned all my information around the operating models in that region. Cambodia is also getting a lot of attention, and that's been an up and down. I'll share the ancient history and how Cambodia was one of the key starting points of this situation. Laos, to some extent, within the Golden Triangle. But now it's evolved, and I'll get to that point as well. So I was just telling Sharlene, my advantage over most of you here is that I'm older and I've been doing this longer. So really, that's it. But collectively, I mean, these things are evolving so quickly, and it's really about all of us sharing information and case notes that we will get a more complete picture. But I'll just indulge me. I'll give you the ancient history. So I started tracking these guys in the early 2000s, and it was really, I was at that point running a investigations and intelligence group that specifically focused on organized crime. And this was fitting the Chinese or Asian organized crime typology. So what we noticed, first of all, there were a bunch of casinos popping up in border areas. So border areas in northern Myanmar, border areas in Cambodia, on both sides, bordering Vietnam and bordering Thailand, and then obviously the well-known casino in the border in Laos, in the border of Thailand. So really, these casinos, both licensed and unlicensed, mostly unlicensed because there was no licensing regime in those countries at that point, were really set up to circumvent the stricter gambling laws in the target countries. So casinos, they started online betting, online lottery businesses, and a lot of these physical casinos then pivoted to these online gaming facilities. Around that, then the concept of accelerating economic growth in the region then came to play. So a lot of the regions where the casinos went to set up then eventually converted into special economic zones, right? Again, sensible. You were across the border. Trade is good. And then what then took place was this explosion of SEZs in various sizes. There was a boom in development. So you had new infrastructure, you had people coming in, building light industry parks, more casinos, hospitality, large-scale residential properties that didn't make sense. There were not enough people to live in it. Smart cities, the whole works. Cheap capital was flowing in, cheap capital that may or may not have legitimate provenance. So again, illicit funds flowing in. There was lax law enforcement in those regions, and there was minimal or virtually zero regulations. So all these enclaves turned to be really unsafe, almost quasi-criminal, sort of areas within the region. This extended not only to the three countries I mentioned, Philippines as well, went through sort of a similar process. Then really things, again, we've sort of talked about this and debated on this. So to me, I think that the tipping point was somewhere in 2014. So 2014, when the new Chinese president came to power, Xi Jinping, and his agenda was anti-corruption, anti-crime. So 2014, he had this big anti-corruption drive in China. You saw a lot of the corrupt officials then flee with money. So again, free capital. 2018, there was a massive multi-year anti-organized crime enforcement project in China. So again, mass exodus of anybody who has a criminal link, has criminal intentions. So we saw all of them, and our assumption is that a lot of them came to this part of the world, into these casinos. Then the economic bubble burst because they overbuilt. Number one. Number two, Cambodia, for instance, saw an exponential rise in crime, so they banned online gaming in Cambodia, right? To some extent, they enforced it, so which saw hundreds and thousands of people who were running online casinos in Cambodia then disperse, and that's probably when they started going into Myanmar, looking at Myanmar as a potential place for them to set up. And this is somewhat consistent because if we use KK Park, which I think Mechelle will talk about to some extent, KK Park is one of the biggest scamming compounds in Myawaddy in Myanmar. If you look at satellite imagery and track back the history, it was about the 2000 and 2001 when they started setting up. I'll try to wrap this up in just a few minutes. So then the next big thing in my view was COVID. So COVID hit 2019, but really we saw the effects mid or late 2020. Few things happened. The casinos now have no ability to bring customers. So the casinos have to now pivot to online gaming, which is very, very competitive because everyone's doing it now. So what were the other options? So that's really when I would argue that they then doubled down and saw a lucrative new revenue avenue, wow, rhymes, which is scamming. So they started investing into scamming or working with scammers to do that. You have, again, trade was ground to a halt. So all these light industries also had no tenants. So then they started opening themselves up to scamming operations. Final point about, and this is where we're going to pivot to the trafficking bit. People couldn't travel, but the global economy during COVID was terrible. People had no opportunities, and that's really when the employment scams then became more and more effective. So people started trafficking themselves, and by default at that point, they had to smuggle themselves because the borders were closed, and then the smuggling became trafficking. And one would argue that even in the early 2000s, when there was just the casino towns, there were already reports of trafficking and forced labor. So people who were being the dealers and all were not released after they finished their contracts. Okay, finishing off on the last bit. So what is the scale of this problem? We all have a number in our head. There have been numbers thrown around, 200,000, 250,000 in the region. I mean, we'll never really know. But what we know is that we're registering increases in the last few years. IOM in 2023 reported that 33% of the trafficking in person cases were linked to forced trafficking. Freedom Collaborative, another NGO that I think all of us, that's where we all met, cited that in 2024, based on the NGOs that work with Freedom Collaborative, the stats indicate that 55% of the trafficking in person cases in 2024 that they have worked on or they have received information on are related to forced criminality. UNODC in the last report has reported trafficking victims from 56 countries. I went through the list. I can't validate every single one, so I'll take them at face value. But I have seen a few other countries that I personally that we have worked on that were not on that list. So really the source countries are far more than 56 countries, which is at least 22 out of 54 countries in Africa, 9 out of 11 countries in Southeast Asia, 6 out of 8 countries in East Asia and South Asia, and the list goes on. Just to round off, I think we're going to discuss this later, but this is not a new thing, right? This has been happening since the late 90s and the 2000s. It's just managed to evolve, and right now we're at this point where I think we're struggling whether to admit it or not that it is a global problem. After this panel, I think there's no argument that it is a global problem. And before I flip it over to back to the panel, there's two parts of the problem. There's the human traffic, well, three actually. There's the human trafficking element. There's the victims that are being scammed around the world. And please don't think that only the rich countries get scammed. The developing countries get scammed more. And the impact of GDP is probably higher than the developed countries. And then the third part is the organized criminals who honestly don't care how they get rich, right? This is just one of many bags in the tricks in the bag. Anyway, hope that answers in a long way, your question.
That is sobering, actually. So, Sharlene, you've been researching in your organization. Y'all do so much of that. And you've been mapping the inner workings of the compounds and the systems that sustain them. Can you walk us through what's enabling the growth and specifically how recruitment, social media, and financial loopholes are being exploited? And finally, how these factors complicate the victim-perpetrator spectrum inside the compounds?
Of course. So that's a huge question, and I'm going to try to break things down to make things clear. And can I have my first slide, please? Oh, okay. Thank you. Yeah. So when we all heard about scam compounds, scam offices, scam company, but what exactly are these scam compounds? Cool. Sorry. So normally, actually, scam compound could be anything. So on the left-hand side, you could see this is like a random residential building. And on the right-hand side, it's more like a business compound, like a huge office-like building. And on both of these pictures, if you see the left-hand side, on the second floor of this building, all of the balconies and the windows are being barred. And also, this may not be clear in the picture, but on the wall, on the surface of the wall, they're scattered of broken glass bottles. And all of these measures are to prevent the victims of trafficking from escaping from these scam compounds. So these scam compounds could be normal office or residential buildings. It could be casinos and five-star hotels that are no longer in operation. Sorry. So, just like what Blue Dragon has also shared yesterday, let's take a look at the inside of these scam compounds. So, most of these scam compounds are filled with office-like rooms. For example, the one on the left-hand side, you could see that there are many laptops and computers lining up in the room. And on the right-hand side is a picture taken by a survivor. This is the dormitory that he has been staying at while he was being trafficked into the compound. And in both of these pictures, if you take a look at the windows on the far end of the rooms, you could see that all of the windows are being barred. Again, another measure to prevent the victims from escaping from the compound. So back to the question. Before we take a look at the key enabler of the scam industry, I would like to walk everyone through the key components of these scam compounds. So first of all, of course, people. We need people to operate these scams. This would include scam managers, criminals, and also the victims of trafficking. And secondly, the facilities and locations, just like this, the actual offices and buildings. And thirdly, the internet service and the social media platforms where the scam are actually being conducted. And finally, which is also another element that's often being overlooked, is money laundering services. So criminals often rely on money laundering services to make sure that all of their criminal proceedings would end up in their pocket without being traced down by law enforcement. So this is a picture of, or a structure and the roles in the scam compound, and this also shows some of the key components that enables the smooth operations of these scam offices or companies. So on the top, we could see local authorities, where they will be receiving bribes from the compound owners and also providing protections to all of these criminal activities. We also have the compound owners, which also serves as the real estate companies to manage all of these buildings, provide their tenants, which are the company owners, which are the criminal groups, spaces, internet services, protection from the local authorities to operate their scam. Where these compound owners, having the company's owners coming into their buildings, company owners would be the one who are employing scammers, other criminals, collaborating with other criminal gangs, groups, and also recruit victims or scammers from all around the world to operate the crime. And on the bottom, you could also see there's employees. These employees would either be scammers or the victims of trafficking. So from here, you could see there is a weak governance and also limited implementation of the legal framework or any sorts of protection framework of the space, which is allowing the victims to be sent into these compounds, be stuck in these compounds, and be forced into all kinds of scam activities for up to several years. Okay, next I would just like to briefly share what's happening inside each of these offices. So this is one of the examples shared by one of the survivors. So he was telling us there were about 40 people per office, and all of these 40 people would be separated into 5 different groups, which means there's 8 people per group, and each of these groups will be allocated one group leader. And this group leader would be in charge of managing all the rest of the 7 group members in the team. So altogether, there's 40 victims / scammers in the room, and collectively, they will need to make or scam at least $1 million per month, which means that's about $200,000 per group, per 8 people. And any group, or if the entire office is not meeting the quota that they were allocated per month, physical abuses, violence, lots of different kinds of punishment would take place. So violence is definitely another key component to ensure the smooth operations of these scam operations. So I'm going to just go back to how these victims are being recruited. So I'll take 2 different examples of the recent trends. So we heard that a lot of the East African victims are being trafficked or being sent to Kenya to the Nairobi International Airport, where there will be traffic to Thailand, most of them to Bangkok International Airport, which they have such perfect connections with the East African countries, especially Kenya. Then these victims will go through local travels from Bangkok to Chiang, where it's pretty close to the Golden Triangle Special Economic Zone, where there could be traffic into the compounds located in the special economic zones. Another example is where migrant workers, legal migrant workers, in some of the Middle Eastern countries, for example, UAE, they would be recruited by other brokers or recruitment agencies to leave they will be convinced to leave their legal construction job or any sorts of other jobs, for example in Dubai, and move to, for example, Thailand, Laos, or Myanmar for a higher paying job. A lot of these legal migrant workers then turn into victims of trafficking and undocumented workers in the Southeast Asian countries. And how are they recruited? And of course, a lot of you may know, social media has become such a great place for recruiting victims. There are lucrative fake job listings online recruiting the victims. And there are also, let's say, a new trend of recruitment of victims. For example, criminals have been targeting specific service provider, entertainers, models from all around the world, provide them with business opportunities in the scam hotspot. And some of the people, normal citizens, may be approached and provided with free traveling experience, free tickets or a free trip to Cambodia, where all of these would end up into kidnapping, where they will be kidnapped into one of these scam compound. Another recent trend that we see is the re-trafficking of the returned survivors. So a lot of, and this is specifically targeting the victims or survivors from the rural area or with financial difficulties, especially when they are in debt. And if they're in countries or areas where job opportunities are scarce, they will be targeted by the scammers and convince them to willingly move back to the Southeast Asian countries again to conduct scam. And unfortunately, we have already witnessed a few survivors, because of their financial difficulties, chose to go back and become a willing participant in the compound. And of course, we have no idea whether or not they are potentially being exploited again, being abused, or being re-trafficked to another country. And back to social media. So I like to share Telegram, which you guys may know is one of the favorite platforms used by the criminals. So how is Telegram being used by the criminals? Of course, posting fake job listing to recruit victims. But we also realized that in some of the channels, these let's say experienced scammers, experienced criminals are also posting their own profile, their nationality, their language abilities, and the fact that they are willing to work for a scam company. So they share their experience online and expect to be recruited by other criminal groups. And on Telegram channels, there are also a few that are dedicated for selling and reselling trafficking victims, where some criminals would post the pictures, the nationality, gender, language ability, whether or not these victims are holding their passport or other traveling documents, and convince or advertise these victims and convince the other criminals to come and purchase these victims to another compound. And I think your question also includes the victim and perpetrator spectrum. Okay, so I'd like to share a recent, let's say, challenge in victim identification and also supporting system for all of the survivors outside of the compound. So when we say victim, how do we define victims? We think about people who have been trafficked. We think about people who have been forced into scamming, who have been beaten up, who have no way to leave the compound. They may be scared, super vulnerable. But in reality, in the compound, especially in the context of forced criminality, it's often difficult to really define what is an ideal victim, because a lot of the activities, a lot of the forced criminality are entangled into these victims' experience. For example, if a victim has been trafficked into a compound in Cambodia, but then while he was working, being trafficked in the compound, he also received a salary and even a small commission from his manager or from his boss. Does it mean that he's still a victim as he is receiving financial gain from the crime? Or a willing participant who willingly joined a scam company, but 2 months later finding out that he's unable to leave, he's being exploited, he's being brutally beaten up by his boss, then is this person still a perpetrator or is he still a victim? So these are some practical questions that law enforcement officers or the NGOs providing sheltering services to the victims or survivors that are actively facing every day. So we will also encourage NGOs, law enforcement to take every part of the trafficking experience or the exploitation experience of each individual into consideration. And we really need to highlight the fact that people have been exploited, either not this person has been forced or in the beginning willingly joining, etc. Yeah, I hope that answers all of the questions.
Thank you. Mechelle, talking about on the ground and the realities that survivors face and gaps in the responses. You've worked really closely with survivors in your organization, like you said a minute ago, people coming out of the compounds and the realities that they experience that a lot of us really haven't even heard about. Can you share what happens after someone is rescued or released, and what are the biggest gaps that you've seen in victim identification, case handling across borders, and reintegration, and how these systems, or how our systems are re-traumatizing victims unintentionally?
Yeah, so my organization since June 2022 has been recovering or supporting potential victims of trafficking out of the scamming compounds. We were called in by Royal Thai Police for the first case in Mesot, and then have been assisting authorities since then, and also embassies, other NGOs, if they're not in the area but they receive cases, will refer them down to us. There's only one other grassroots group that is working in Mesot as well, so we are all very short-staffed. So as a collective, since June 2022, we have recovered and supported more than 1,000. In February, there were 9,000, I think, 853. Oh, can you hear me? 9,853 that were released through a controlled release. But when you're just talking about victims who either pay a ransom to get out or are released for I don't know what to call it, because they're physically broken, yeah, or because they escape. So when we get the call, we either go to their location and recover them. Sometimes they are in hospital because their bodies have been so broken. We generally have around 48 hours legally before we can or have to report them to authorities. So in that time, my organization tries to conduct a forensic interview, which is not always possible, but it goes towards or helps them through the reporting process. Victim identification is one of the main gaps in any kind of reporting of potential victims of trafficking for forced criminality. And I say potential victims because not everybody coming out of the scamming compound is a victim. So you have to go through a victim identification process. There are many people that don't, and they, in Thailand, for example, you can report yourself to the authorities for illegally crossing the border from Myanmar into Thailand, and then go into immigration detention, and then pay your own way home. That is one option. But if you want to go through the formal victim identification process, it is quite a process and it is very traumatizing. We try and conduct a forensic interview, one, to collect data, but also to support their application. Like Sharlene was saying, you have to take the entire experience into consideration. So that interview is with permission of the potential victim given to authorities to support their application or their victim identification process. I think when we're talking about victim identification, there are a lot of misidentified people. So whether you're talking about victims identified as criminals or vice versa, I think the process across Southeast Asia is not working. Thailand does have the national referral mechanism, which at its heart is it has a good structure to it, but I think it's missing some in-depth processes to it to give it some meat. So when victims do come to authorities in Thailand, they go through what we call a screening, and it is, with support of a forensic interview, very straightforward to get someone through a screening, because the majority of people going into scamming compounds, whether you're a criminal or a victim, have indicators of being a victim, right? So that's fine. They get into a government shelter, and then that process through the victim identification interviews in Thailand is where it falls down. People are misidentified. The interview is not conducted really in a trauma-informed way. It's often done in a crowded room, and you might have 4 or 5 people being interviewed at the same time by a panel of 5 or 6 people for each victim. At times, CSOs are allowed to provide a case advocate, so we can sit next to the potential victim while they're going through the interview, but that's not always the case. And then it's inappropriate questions, normally based on a lack of training. There has been a lot of training in MESOT, don't get me wrong. We have been trained for many, many years, but it's the wrong people attending the training. So the people actually doing the job are so busy doing the job, they don't take the time out to go and do the training. And those who are trained don't come back and pass that information on. Another one is lack of cross-border coordination and data sharing. So we don't do that. My organisation does work in with law enforcement, Ministry of Justice. Through BC, we've been able to work with many international law enforcement agencies. We've shared data, interviews, and all of that has gone towards investigations into potential bad actors. So we've had some arrests, which have been great, in Uganda and Kenya. And we've got ongoing investigations in Dubai, Singapore, and many other countries. However, we are one CSO doing that. I don't know of any other CSO that's actually actively doing this for forced criminality. So if we actually had CSOs who are the ones that hold all the data, partnering with law enforcement, and then have an appetite with law enforcement to go and investigate, then we would be able to track down the main criminals, right? Another thing is we have inconsistent legal policies and frameworks. So we have I know UNODC is working on this, and we need groups like them to work on this. But when you don't have consistent victim identification practices across multiple countries, and you have victims from, what did you say UNODC reported, like 55? 56. Yeah, I think we're up to like 71 now that we've got on record. So you're dealing with multiple law enforcement agencies. You're dealing with lots and lots of different embassies. You have an inconsistency of legal frameworks and policies across all of the different countries. So where you're identified as a victim in one country, you then go to another and you're not identified as a victim. A very good example of that is China. So they might be identified as a victim in Thailand, but then they go back to China and they're not identified as a victim. China's not the only country. There's many others that do that. Vice versa, they might not be identified as a victim in Thailand, but they are in their own country. So if we had some consistency, that would go a long way into supporting victims and survivors when they're returning home. we've talked about training, and I think there's a serious lack of victim-centered and trauma-informed approaches, not just from government, from CSOs as well. And don't get me wrong, I'm a CSO, we all make mistakes. But I think sometimes we can get so caught up in the work that we're doing that we forget that we're dealing with humans. And these humans have gone through this horrible, horrible experience that none of us will ever understand because we have not gone through it. And then we thrust them into this process that is just, it's traumatizing for the people walking through them in the process, let alone the people having to experience that. And there is no, when you come out of the scamming compound, so the survivors have said this to me, I was so excited. I've been talking to you for months, and I came out of the scamming compound thinking that I was free, but then I was thrust into another process and I wasn't free until I eventually got home, and then I still wasn't free because no one understood what I'd been through. And so that whole reintegration process, that piece is missing. We're just starting to work on it now. There's different collaborations of CSOs around the globe that are working towards this. Asia Rise Foundation Thailand and Asia Freedom Network, Global Alms and Ezekiel Rain, we've put out a 4-volume manual on how to support survivors specifically for trafficking and persons for forced criminality and assist them in reintegration. So it's training for families and communities and CSOs, and we have another version that we're writing for government officials and embassies. But that reintegration piece, people don't understand. People are just learning about forced criminality now, especially the cyber scamming forced criminality, and the level of brutality that people have to experience and the psychological trauma that they go through is unlike any other I've seen in any other typology. It rocks people to its core, and it's breaking young people from all over the world.
It's brutal. I have seen this resource that Michelle's talking about, and we'll make sure that that is linked up as well in our notes on this session. It's super, super fantastic. The GLC has also had a workshop on it, so definitely if you're interested in that resource, make sure you connect, and we can either get you a video of that workshop, or you can access the toolkit. So I want to move to just a few questions from me, and then we'll move to questions from you guys. So if you have questions in your head, make sure you're putting those in the Whova app for us, so we'll be ready with those in a few minutes. Let's start with BC. So why is it dangerous to treat this just as a cybercrime or a fraud issue? And what is one thing that you think governments are consistently getting wrong about scamming compounds, and what are the shifts that need to happen in how we frame these operations?
Answer to the first question is because it's not. It seems to manifest at this point. Well, it's not, and it is, and it's everything else. To me, if you frame it purely or exclusively as a cybercrime or cyber-enabled crime, I think you're missing a lot of the bigger picture. Right now, I think it's just a manifestation of what is available and what they're successful in. There's been that trafficking persons, forced criminality issue persistent in that for a long time. So that, just framing it as a cybercrime issue then forgets about that part. There's that transnational organized crime part that has been persistent since the early 2000s, late 90s and early 2000s. So even if we do manage to alleviate, solve, suppress the trafficking persons element to it, they will find a new criminal avenue, and then we'll all be back here again, maybe not this conference hall and this specific group of people, but we're all going to be struggling for the next 5-10 years to solve that next manifestation. The other thing that I feel that we struggle to acknowledge is also that, I try to share the ancient history of this in a very linear format, but it's actually not. It's everything is just sort of conspired together as it might appear, but people were just opportunistically and organically reacting to the situation on the ground. That's how it's built itself in a very resilient way. While we also need to acknowledge that it's not one, there's no one boss, there's no one organized crime group. It's an illicit market, it's an ecosystem. And in that ecosystem are many young, old, experienced, willing criminals who want to participate are benefiting from it. There's also no real domination by any nationality, perhaps initially, but we're seeing Indonesians bosses, we're seeing Malaysian bosses, people will partake, right? And that's really where I think we need to recognize this as an illicit marketplace ecosystem, and then we need to address that holistically. Which then comes to the second part of your question, what are countries doing wrong? I'll list a few, but it's maybe not wrong, but how they have reacted to the circumstances they have been put in. So you have two parts of the story. You have the countries where their citizens are being scammed, like the investment fraud scams, and then you have the countries where trafficking persons, victims are being trafficked to commit the scams. So two separate parts. And then in between, to Sharlene's point, people are laundering money because it's a global economic system, right? It's a wicked problem because law enforcement or law enforcement is not structured to function cross borders. Law enforcement is designed to structure to excel within one legal jurisdiction. When you start throwing another legal jurisdiction, it becomes complicated. When you throw a dozen jurisdictions in, everyone falls apart. So it genuinely doesn't work. So countries are then retreating to their comfort zone is, I will deal with my territory, I will deal with my law and my jurisdiction, which is what all the governments are doing. They're hardening in terms of their financial systems, they're hardening in terms of their vulnerability to financial scams, they're hardening themselves at checkpoints so that people leaving will get interviewed. But again, how far would that go, right? Then on the reverse side, where countries are, victims are being trafficked, either a transit country or destination country, I will say a few things, maybe in the defense of those countries. So one, corruption's a real issue. They are developing countries, they are susceptible to corruption. Corruption is very much part of that ecosystem, so we need to address that. Number two is capacity and capability of those countries to do what they need to, right? Mechelle talked about the 1,000 that she's managed to help. Imagine if the government had to do that. No. The 9,000 that came out, they had no capacity to do any interviews or even feed them, right? There are countries now, they've stopped doing raids in compounds because the Ministry of Foreign Affairs has no more budget to do deportations, right? So there are genuine reasons why, there are constraints. So in a positive way, and that's really why I'm hoping to have this conversation and why I'm still working with the nice people on this panel, is that one, I think we need to communicate this issue widely and globally, and I think we need to communicate there is a strategy that we can all work collectively. We can work across national boundaries. So across national boundaries, across types of organizations. So government to government, NGOs to NGOs, businesses to businesses, and all of us across. Because we all know a little bit of the topic uniquely, and we all have a bit of a unique influence on the topic. So the only way we can really address this effectively is that we all work together. And that's my key point of why I want to be here and support this.
You're singing my favorite song. Collectives, coalitions, I think, are the answer really to trafficking across the board. So I think applying it to this particular one makes total sense to me. Thank you. So Sharlene, I love this question. What is the most overlooked enabler of scam compounds growth today?
Can people hear me? Okay, cool. So that's a great question. From my side, I would say definitely money laundering. So I believe that financial sectors, financial institutions, banks, they really have the budget, they have the money, they have the power to protect their customers and to stop the financial flow from the criminals. Because where there are criminals' accounts, where there are financial flows, there are scam, there are operations. And without these financial resources, scam operations couldn't operate. They can't feed 500 workers and rent offices for 500 people for month and month and month. And so I just like to quickly share a few emerging money laundering trends that I see. So one is called guarantee company. So what is guarantee company? Guarantee companies are companies that provides money laundering services for the criminal groups. So let's say the criminals, they do not, while they're conducting money laundering or while they're doing these illicit affairs, they may not really want to know who their collaborators are. They do not want to know their names. They do not want to expose themselves to potentially other criminals or even people that may be dangerous to them, even though they themselves are also criminals. So these guarantee companies provides a perfect platform to link different different criminal gangs, different scam companies together. They provide them with services such as establishing shell company abroad, providing them with dummy accounts or different cryptocurrency accounts to conduct money laundering. And there's recently also a dedicated app for money laundering, and it's called 跑分 in Chinese. And I called this a Uber or Grab app for money laundering. So what you do is any normal citizens, including every single one in this room, we can easily download this app, this 跑分 app, register an account, pay a guarantee fee to the app, and we can start receiving orders. So what do we do with these orders? All we have to do is to receive a specific amount of money from another account, potentially a criminal, to our personal account, and use our personal bank account to transfer this money back to another person, which generally will be another criminal. And by each of these orders, each of these transactions that we've complete, I will receive a small commission. And yeah, this is how easy any normal citizens could be included in these money laundering value chain. And apart from money laundering, I also like to, it's more like a call for action and also sharing. We should really look at some good people that may have unconsciously become part of the trafficking process, or these people may have the chance to stop trafficking but may not be empowered to do so or not have the right tool to do so. And these people are the airline staff, the airport staff, transportation company, traveling agencies that have assisted, well, unconsciously, of course, the traffickers to traffic their victims. So if the airline staff, flight attendants, crew members on the ground, custom officers at the airport, any staff at the airport, traveling agencies that are making traveling plans for their clients, if these people are being equipped with the, for example, understanding of what trafficking in the scam industry is, if they understand what the red flags are, how to identify potential victims or potential trafficking routes that are happening within their services, they could be the gatekeeper to stop this trafficking from happening. They could be the person that's stopping the victims from being transferred to the third country. So what we need are training and, also mentioned by Mechelle, collaboration between different borders. Data needs to be shared between different borders. And these good people that are normally being overlooked, but they have the power, they have the chance to stop trafficking, they also need to be prioritized in this entire fight against the scam and human trafficking.
Sounds like there's a lot of potential points of intervention, which is really good news. That's very cool. Mechelle, you talked a little bit about gaps in victim identification efforts. I'm curious if there's one urgent need that you feel like frontline responders are facing right now that's really not being resourced or recognized at all.
I'm going to do a shameless plug now.
Do it.
Funding. for grassroots organizations on the ground doing the work, please. If you are supporting NGOs who work in the human trafficking space, that's great. Can you please also support grassroots organizations like mine with funding? If you don't have a lot of funding, you can go out there and buy a Global Alms t-shirt. 100% of the profits go towards recovering victims of trafficking. No, seriously, we have a serious problem with funding on the ground. We understand that not every NGO can go into the hotspots. That's totally understandable. But when you're talking about providing training for first-line responders, whether they're CSOs or government officials, that requires funding. It also requires the right relationships. So it's great to come in with a project and do training, but if you don't have the right relationships on the ground, then you don't train the right people, and then that's lost money, right? So supporting grassroots organizations who are actually on the ground doing the work is one, but then also being able to raise awareness yourself. So we have a global issue right now, and we have a lot of people interested. We don't have enough people talking about this. We don't have enough prevention activities going on. We have a lot of NGOs that are really, really busy, so we need everybody else to help us in this fight, right? So I'd say funding and prevention, they're probably the two main ones. Countries are coming together slowly. There's something called the Emergency Response Network that's set up by UNODC, which is law enforcement agencies from all over Southeast Asia have got together and they have one task force. So they are actively meeting and working out ways where they can work with CSOs, work with in their own governments, and then also work together to share information across borders, and then also collectively try and hunt down the perpetrators of these crimes, right? So I'd say they're probably the top three: funding, prevention, and then collaboration would be another issue.
Yeah, and even the collaboration when you're talking about having government and CSOs together, where do the CSOs get their money so that they can collaborate with the
Yes,
government?
everything costs money.
Yep, unfortunately. Awesome. I'm very excited we left quite a bit of time. I know there's a lot of interest in this topic, and a lot of us are really wanting to learn more. I know in our network in Indonesia, there's a lot of conversations about, well, we've never really worked with victims of scamming compounds before, and we know it's a little bit different than what we've done. How do we do this well? So I know that there's probably lots and lots of questions. I think Lucy, or you and Chris, gonna ask some questions for us?
Yeah.
Thank you.
Our first question is that as AI becomes more prevalent in scam operations, how will we see things change? Will chatbots and face swap AI affect the number of trafficked people needed to operate?
I think we've definitely seen a change since around 2023 when there was specifically one case. We had 2 women from Turkey, and they were up in a scamming compound in Tachile. And they were trafficked in specifically for their skill set, which was to design a face swapping software. And then that software has then been spread around. It's also more have come on the market. It's very popular now. And then we have the deep fakes and all that sort of stuff. I'm not a techie person, so this is not going to get technical. However, when you're talking about scamming compounds, there are, specifically in Myanmar, if you want to talk to Cambodia, that's okay. Specifically in Myanmar, there are only a handful of compounds that actually have that infrastructure in place. KK Park is actually 4 scamming compounds now. It's grown so large. They have the infrastructure in place to have AI within their businesses, their business model, I should say. So they generally use the face swapping software instead of having models come in to do the video calls under the romance scams, right? However, a lot of the smaller scamming compounds haven't invested in that infrastructure, so they're still relying on that human element. And even when you have AI, there is always a human element to it, because AI doesn't cater for everything. You have to have you will always have human touch points, right? So there will be, I think, a tipping point where, or the scamming compounds are hoping there's a tipping point, where you have more career scammers in the scamming compounds than you do human trafficking victims. We have not reached that yet, and I don't think we'll reach that soon, but it is increasing. The amount of people that are still purposefully seeking this out is increasing every day with the more awareness about what's happening. We're not changing the fundamental problems in the countries that they're coming from. So the more knowledge they gain out of learning about scamming compounds and what's available, it's lucrative money for very little skill set, and they don't have other options in their own countries. So if you're talking about prevention mechanisms, within their source countries where these victims and survivors are coming from, change the situation that they're in, and then you will have less people willing to come and scam. You will have less people taking the risk of going and getting jobs or applying for jobs in other countries because they will be able to find gainful employment in their own countries or maybe surrounding countries, but they're not taking that risk. When you talk to survivors, there are always these red flags that come up, and I understand it's a complex process. You always have an agent that is always quashing those concerns that you have, reassuring you throughout the whole process, but it's still a high-risk process, right? So if you have that tinge of, this is really, really risky, but I've got to take the chance because I don't have any other options, let's give them some other options.
Do you have another question for us?
Yes. What would CSOs need in terms of infrastructure or system support in order to be enabled to prevent or address or partner on fighting forced criminality?
So we are a consultancy, so we don't really rely on, for example, donations. But from all of the NGOs that we partner with, for example, in the beginning of the emergence in around 2021, 2022, after COVID, realized we were partnering with Gaza, which is a global anti-scam organization. And there are so many volunteers traveling to Cambodia and bordered with Myanmar to rescue the victims. And all they need is really funding, just like what Mechelle mentioned. They need funding because all of these volunteers, they're working for free. They paid for their own flights to go and negotiate with people, with the criminals, negotiate with the compound owners, and rescue the victims. And some of them would need to support the financial debt from for these victims, especially for their visa, their overstayed fee, as they were trafficked and being forced to stay in this country for so long. So these victims couldn't leave the country before they clean up their debt with the government. And also, a lot of the victims, they need emergency medical support. As we heard, a few victims, in order to leave the compound, they jumped from the building and they were sent to the hospital without clearing out their debt, their medical bills with the hospital. They're not able to leave the countries. So yeah, so short answer, funding, like funding collaborations, but most importantly, funding is really the key to enable all of these work to continue.
Can I agree? And I just want to add maybe a little bit, just one element of a detail. So if our North Star is to take down these criminals, and the way of taking them down is to get law enforcement to work more effectively, one, and two, to Sharlene's point, if we can stop them from profiting, right? So the anti-money laundering element comes in, they stop profiting, it's not lucrative, they'll move on, right? That's the hope. If that's the case, and if you go all the way down to where the first responding CSOs are, what I would say is your ability to capture information and to capture them in a clean and accurate way that we can then share, collaborate, and corroborate across the system. So when I first met Mechelle 3 years ago, my expectation was that the first responders would have incredible levels, color, detail of the cases that nobody else in the world would have. No law enforcement, no intel agency would. I was proven right, except it was like one room piled to the ceiling of paper case files, right? Which, I didn't, but I took a few, but if I had to database that, it would be a 1 year's worth of work, or more. But the idea is if CSOs or first line responders can have a clean ability to consume data, to capture data, and to collate them, it will be immensely powerful. And then multiplied by the number of us in this room, we'll be halfway there, right, in getting the answers.
I think we have a few more questions. It looks like they are rolling in, so we still have 20 minutes, which is fantastic.
Okay, this is a specific one. But in the last few days, thousands of people have been arrested in Cambodia and face deportation. The official line seems to be that it will take too long to investigate if they were victims or not, and it's better to deport them. What do you think has driven this recent crackdown?
I'm only going there in a month's time. No, just kidding. I don't know how to answer that. I mean, to the point. Well, first of all, two personal reflections. Number one is, if there's the right level of motivation, things can be done. So I was pleasantly pleased that there is a crackdown. To what extent the crackdown really is and what the motivation is, we can debate that over coffee later. But back to the point, right? Again, if you were a law enforcement official in a country, in your country, what is your job and what's your purpose and objective? It's to serve your people, right? I mean, that will be first and foremost to you keeping your job, not something else that another country has asked for. That's not a priority. So we need to understand and put ourselves in the shoes of law enforcement or government officials. And number two is it's thousands of people. The ability for you to work across languages and to do a forensic interview, it's a very, very, very lengthy process. I've gone through a few of them. I've sat there. They don't speak the same language. Getting the name right and then screening that name across immigration database, which is part one of the interview, takes like 45 minutes. And they still can't get it right. At the end of it, the official just says, okay, fine, you're an illegal immigrant. You never came in through the right channels. And simply because they couldn't find the Romanized version of the right name to find it on a database. So it is a very, very lengthy process, and thus a very, very costly process. Because again, the longer I take to interview you, I have to feed you, healthcare, you fall off a building, the security I need to provide, that you don't stab each other in detention, all that adds up to cost. So again, then my question is, are we solving the problem, or are we just dealing with the symptoms? By not interviewing, I argue we're just dealing with the symptoms.
That makes sense.
How can we encourage financial integrity regulators to move beyond just shoring up business assets against scamming to participate in addressing the risk to people caught up in these nefarious schemes?
Yeah, first of all, I believe that all of the customers of the banks would love to be protected by their banks. So one thing that we really want to advocate and also want to either provide training or convince the financial institutions is that yes, you're of course protecting the assets. You want to meet all of the KYC, know your customers standards. You want to have beautiful, perfect ESG or sustainability report that you're publishing every year. But the most important thing is really to recognize the red flags and also if one of your customer is raising any issues is sharing with you a alerted account or a alerted activities, or simply have questions about one of the transactions that he made or or she made or he or she have received. How do banks really respond to that? And one thing is that if we could convince the banks that there is a role that you could take over, there is a role that you really have the chance, you do have the power to protect your customers. You do have the resource to address these problems. You do have the resource to set up a proper mechanisms within your bank system. And you do have the resource to share these information with your fellow banks and with the law enforcement, and really make sure that if a customer is raising a red flag about a account, you're able to really escalate this to the law enforcement, to the entire financial sector, to make sure that everyone, instead of just you as a bank officer, everyone in the sector could really know that, okay, this is happening, there's something alerting, and there is something that we can all do together.
I have a very novel, well, not novel idea, but I feel strongly about this. If the criminals are doing this to make profit, then that should be the target of our activities. So what I've been pushing a lot of, well, advising, recommending to governments is to use asset forfeiture laws, which a lot of them do not have in an effective way within their legal system. So when they do a raid, when they make an arrest, they should target first and foremost an asset forfeiture. Get the assets, repurpose the assets for law enforcement, and it becomes a self-sustaining business model, right? They can now afford to interview 400 people if detained. So that's one way. It has been purposed for other criminal typologies in history, so that it is a possibility. But again, changes in laws take time, so that's one. Two, from a scamming victim perspective, from a financial institution perspective, asset recovery through civil litigation process. So again, the government has claims, but so do civilians. So if you're a victim of human trafficking, you're a victim of a scam, if you can find a way back to who scammed you, and that's the problem, right? That's the wicked problem. I'm just saying, hypothetically, we all have fantastic systems and great intelligence, and we found that answer. Then, civil asset recoveries through civil litigation or civil laws would be extremely painful. Because imagine they're all parking their nice mansions in London, in New York, and then you're going there and you're sealing it. It's beautiful, right? So that's the two ideas.
That's awesome. What are the best practices that can be implemented for awareness and education to prevent victimization from source countries?
Best practices. Okay, so there are a couple of small projects. So a friend of mine out of Singapore is doing a digital literacy program. And she is educating older people, people from remote communities in digital literacy, and then also scamming awareness. So then they're not scammed, and then they're also, she talks about human trafficking, the human trafficking element in that as well. So when they're applying for jobs in remote cities or in other countries, then they have some kind of awareness around the potential dangers. I think we have to protect our young people and educate them in this space. When we're talking about scamming for forced criminality, so as in human trafficking victims, like I said before, if we don't fix the issues in those source countries, then they are always going to look outside. I mean, that's a very long-term wish list. Don't get me wrong, it's not a simple problem to fix. But I think it's really important to get into schools and into local communities and to have CSOs fully engaged on the ground in those source countries. Best practices. I think survivor engagement is important, but before everybody goes running to find survivors to interview them, to get first-hand knowledge and get them engaged in the process, I think we need to provide reintegration support and ongoing services and support services for those survivors before they are included in that process. I think their inclusion is really important, but I think with good intentions, we are hurting a lot of people who have already come from a really traumatic place. And this is relatively new, this typology, right? So I know we've had scamming for many, many years, but when we're talking about the scamming compounds and then the scamming centers in Cambodia and Laos, the level of trauma that they've gone through and the lack of support is just unbelievable, really. So although I think it is important to have them engaged in that process, I think it's really important for CSOs to go and use research material first and then provide some kind of support process or support mechanism when you are including survivors in that process.
I'll just add to that. So I agree that local communities, local CSOs really have the opportunities and role to protect of the survivors who are at risk of being re-trafficked. And for the survivors who are more willing to share their experience, they may be, for example, either less traumatized, or even though they're really traumatized, they're still willing to share their experience. Provide these survivors with training, with funding, with opportunities, with platforms to really share their experience with other young people, local school, local occupational training centers. Let these survivors utilize their local social networks, their language abilities, their understanding, their cultural background of their local communities to help and to protect the kids, to protect the young adults, to protect all of the job seekers in his own community by sharing his or her own experience.
I think we have time for maybe one or two more.
Yep. Okay. Given the context of the countries and jurisdictions that the scam compounds are in, what do you think is the future of successful prosecution for the senior crime bosses?
They're not there, by the way. So the bosses won't be there. It's the middle of nowhere. It's good reception, but not a lot for leisure activities. So we have technical means of tracking where, who's coming in and out. My personal view so far, and we need a lot more work on targeting the bosses. And to Sharlene's graph, there's a lot of bosses. Obviously, we want the top one, but anyone in between, the manager to the top guy, I think that's fair game and good game to play on. So first of all, they're not there. If you look at the Singapore $3 billion case, it shows you typically where they go, and they have everyday problems like you and I. Our kids need to go to school. We need a nice house. We need a nice car. Same, everyday issues. Number two is the assets are not there either. The assets are definitely not there. In fact, barely any of the money that's scammed goes back to the operating jurisdictions that we've named. Very, very minimal, just to operate, pay the bribes, and do whatever is needed. All that money goes to the big money laundering washing machine, ends up somewhere in a developed country. So again, that's the vulnerability. So the short answer is, while the source of the problem might be in this jurisdiction, the answer does not necessarily need to be in that jurisdiction, is my point.
Can infrastructure, for example, electricity, cellular service of these compounds be disrupted?
Technically, yes. But how do we do it? So one challenge that we've been witnessing is that, yes, these scam companies, they are doing a lot of illicit affairs. They may be illegal. They may not be registered, let's say, in these countries. However, the compound owner they may be legitimate, well, on the paper legitimate, they may be legitimate real estate company. And with these legitimate real estate company, when they're requiring any electricity, internet services from the local provider, they can't say no because they seem legitimate on the paper. So what is really needed is evidence. How do we collectively collect evidence? And how do we present these evidence? And how, like whether or not there's going to be, let's say, a legal foundation in those scam hotspots that could really utilize these evidence to sue these real estate companies that are managing the scam compound, and to target off the smaller actors, which is the owner of the scam company within these compounds, and to somehow stop the electricity or water services or internet services.
So I'll just add to that. With Myanmar and Thailand, we've had many attempts, and the latest one is still going. Sometimes they'd shut off power, sometimes they'd shut off internet. Most recently this year, they've shut off internet, power, and they've stopped the sale of fuel into Myanmar, which made the biggest impact. However, over the past 3 years, they've managed to get Starlink in all of the compounds, so they have internet without Thailand's internet, and they all have generators without Thailand's power, so they need fuel. So there was a point where over maybe 2 or 3 months, they were rerouting power from dormitories just to office buildings, but there was not one day of disruption in scamming. Even the day of the earthquake, everyone went to work. There were no cracks in the building, no buildings fell down. So, and the sale of fuel has started again. So not from Thailand into Myanmar, but they've found a loophole where they can buy fuel, and if it transits through Thailand, then it's not stopped. So they can just purchase it from another country. If you wanted to seriously starve out the scamming compounds in Myanmar, shut down all the illegal registered gates. There's 49 of them. All the illegal crossings across the river, that's how they get the majority of stuff across. There'd be no food, there'd be no fuel, and there'd be no one coming in and out.
Thank you. Can we do one more?
How can individuals outside of formal organizations make a meaningful impact in the fight against forced criminality?
Can I say donation?
Yes, you can. Ding, ding, ding.
Yeah, I mean, Mechelle's organization, a lot of different organizations, grassroots organizations that are really fighting on the ground. Reintegration support are needed in the victim-sending countries. And apart from donations, also sharing reports, not just the larger UNODC reports or larger think tanks report, but also the local NGOs reports, their impact report. Most of the NGOs, the smaller NGOs, they do have like a bi-yearly or annual impact report, which really details all of the good work that they're doing. And if you're not able to do donations, it doesn't matter. Share the impact report, share the screenshots of the work that they're doing, share how many people have been rescued or supported by them.
I was just gonna say we're all individuals, anyway, right? We're all. I mean, I'm with Kroll, but I'm not here for Kroll. I'm here because these are my friends, and it's a meaningful project that we're working on. So I don't have a straight answer for you, but any way you can. That's the point of having this conference. Have a chat with any of us. You never know. There might be an emergency. One of you guys need volunteers. That could be one element. Anything from donations to translations to transcription to editorial work, or just be a great, awesome neighbor and part of the community. Share the stories, tell the stories, and you have somebody who is vulnerable, have a chat and make sure that that person is well informed.
That's awesome. Thank you guys. That was fabulous. We have a whole bunch more questions online, so if you guys want to take those at some point later today and just get to those, that'd be amazing. In the chat, there's the toolkit that Mechelle mentioned, so there's links to that as well, so you can take a look at that.
We are going to move to our group photo, and then we're going to go straight from that into our coffee break. So if you are not wearing a red lanyard, we'd love to get you up here on stage, and the quicker we do it, the longer your coffee break. So come on up here, you guys. Let's do this photo thing, because we have to do that. And then we'll head to coffee break. After that, we have breakout sessions, so make sure you check the Whova app for the agenda, because things did get shuffled around in the last few days. So you know which breakout you want to go to.